The sound came just before sunset. Not wind, not coyote, but something broken and human. A voice. A plea. Please, don't let me die of thirst. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and let us know where you're watching from in the comments. This Western story is just beginning. The creek had almost vanished that summer. What little water
all right?
remained crawled through the rocks like a wounded animal.
Drink some water.
Thin and stubborn, refusing to die. Elias Crow crouched by the bank, filling his canteen, his reflection blurring in the weak current. The silence around him was heavy, the kind that made a man forget what voices sounded like. Then came that cry. He rose, scanning the horizon. The wind pressed against him, dry and hot, but the sound came again faint, trembling, and close. He followed it down the slope, rifle over his shoulder, boots kicking up dust. Near a tumble of stone, he saw them. 3 figures, slumped together in the sand. Apache women young, sunburned, barely breathing. The oldest raised her head when his shadow crossed her face. Her lips cracked open. "Water," she whispered. "Please." Elias knelt, pulling the cork from his canteen. He tilted it gently toward her mouth. She drank like she'd forgotten how to breathe. The second woman reached for it next, shaking so hard that the water spilled down her throat. The youngest just stared, eyes glassy with fever. He lifted her chin and helped her drink too. When the last drop was gone, the oldest grabbed his sleeve. Her voice was hoarse, her words broken by exhaustion. "You give water," she said. "You save. We sleep with you." Elias froze. Not because of the words, but because of what lay behind them: desperation, not desire. A bargain born from death's doorstep. He looked at them, their trembling hands, their cracked skin, the hopeless fire still burning in their eyes. He could have walked away, pretended he hadn't heard. But the silence that would follow would haunt him forever. So he did the only thing a man could do. He lifted the first woman into his arms, then the second, then the third. They were light as ghosts, barely alive. He carried them toward his cabin, through the dying light and the cold wind. That night, his solitude ended and his story began. The cabin stood at the edge of the canyon, built from wood that had forgotten what it meant to be new. Elias pushed the door open with his shoulder, boots scraping against the threshold. The women in his arms barely stirred. He laid them down one by one on the old cot near the stove, 3 strangers who smelled of blood, dust, and the Sunday. The air inside was cool and dry, thick with the faint scent of pine smoke and loneliness. Elias stoked the coals until a thin flame crawled up, throwing amber light across the room. He poured water into a tin bowl, wet a cloth, and wiped their faces gently. The youngest flinched, not from fear but from habit, as if every touch before had come with pain. He didn't ask questions. He didn't have the right words for them anyway. All he could do was move quiet, careful, like he was fixing something that didn't belong to him. Hours passed before one of them spoke. The oldest, dark eyes, hair matted with dirt, lifted her head just enough to see him. Her English was broken but clear enough. "You give water." Elias nodded once, unsure where this was going. "You husband now," she said simply, and let her head fall back onto the blanket. The words settled into the room like dust after a storm. Elias froze. He almost laughed, not out of cruelty but disbelief. Husband? He hadn't been anyone's husband for 10 years. His wife's grave lay somewhere beyond the cottonwoods, under a pile of stones he'd built when the ground was too hard to dig. He looked at them again, 3 half-dead women he'd found in the desert. Whatever rule they believed in, it wasn't one he understood. "You don't owe me anything," he muttered. "Drink and rest. That's all." But they didn't answer. Their eyes followed him with the same unblinking steadiness, and something in that silence felt heavier than gratitude. It was as if they'd already decided something, and he was the only one who hadn't caught up. Outside, the light began to fade. Elias stepped to the door, scanning the horizon. The sun had dropped behind the ridge, leaving streaks of crimson cloud. No riders, no dust, just the ache of the wind across the dry brush. He barred the door out of habit, though he couldn't have said what danger he expected now. When he turned back, the 3 women were awake. They sat close to one another, sharing the same blanket. The oldest spoke again, voice steadier this time. You give, we belong. Elias rubbed a hand over his face. That's not how it works, he said softly. She tilted her head, not understanding or maybe not caring. Water is life. You give life. He wanted to tell her that water didn't make bonds, that people did. But the words felt hollow in his mouth. There had been a time he believed that too, that kindness could exist without consequence. That time was gone. He took a piece of venison from the shelf and warmed it over the fire. The smell filled the small space, drawing faint hunger into their eyes. He broke it into 3 pieces and handed each to them. They ate slowly, as if remembering how. The youngest murmured a few words in Apache that he didn't know, and the other 2 repeated them. A prayer maybe, or a promise. When the food was gone, they looked to him again, waiting. Elias sat back on his chair, the fire crackling between them. You can stay until you're strong enough to walk, he said. After that, you go where you need to. The room stayed quiet. The middle one, the one with the long scar along her arm, shook her head. We stay. You gave. Elias leaned forward, elbows on his knees, trying to meet their eyes. Why me? He asked, more to himself than them. You don't know who I am. You don't know what I've done. But they didn't answer. They didn't have to. The truth was, he didn't know either anymore. Later, when they had fallen asleep, Elias sat by the stove watching the shadows crawl up the wall. The wind pressed against the cabin like a hand testing for weakness. He stared at the canteen on the table, half empty, and thought about the moment he'd poured it against their lips. It had felt simple then, a mercy. Now it felt like a thread that tied him to something he hadn't chosen but couldn't undo. He remembered his wife's voice, soft and fading in his memory. Don't close the door on kindness, Eli. It's the only thing that makes a man worth saving. He looked at the sleeping figures, 3 strangers breathing the same air, alive because of him, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel entirely alone. Outside, coyotes howled far down the canyon, their voices echoing through the cold. Elias fed another log into the fire and whispered into the crackle of wood and flame, rest while you can. Tomorrow, the world comes asking for what it thinks it owns. He didn't yet know how right he was. Morning crept in slow, pale, and cold. Elias woke to the sound of breathing not his own, but 3 softer rhythms that wove together in the small cabin. For a moment, he forgot where he was. Then the memory returned. The creek, the canteen, the words that still echoed inside him. You give water, you husband now. He sat up, the chair creaking under his weight. The fire had burned down to embers. He tossed in a few sticks, watching the orange glow return. The light touched their faces, tired, bruised, but no longer gray with thirst. They looked human again, and that alone felt like a small miracle. He stepped outside, boots crunching over frost. The canyon still held the chill of night. His horse snorted from the corral, steam rising from its nostrils. Elias filled the water trough, checked the traps near the ridge, and scanned the dirt for tracks. Nothing. No riders yet. But his gut told him the quiet wouldn't last. It never did. When he came back inside, the smell of wood smoke had softened. One of the women was awake, the middle one, tall, hair braided loose down her back. She stood by the table, holding his tin cup awkwardly in both hands. Her eyes darted toward him, wary but not afraid. I make fire, she said. Her voice was low, musical under the rough English. Elias nodded once. Good, he replied, unsure if she understood. The other 2 stirred soon after. The youngest, small, delicate, eyes wide with something that was half fear, half curiosity, watched every move he made. The oldest, the one who had spoken the night before, sat cross-legged by the stove, pressing her palm over her shoulder where the wound had closed to a faint pink line. Elias cooked breakfast in silence, coffee black as tar, dried meat softened with water. He handed each of them a tin plate. They ate without a word. When one piece fell from the youngest trembling hand, the oldest took it and gave it back to her, quiet, firm. It was the kind of care Elias hadn't seen since his wife died, simple, instinctive, unspoken. He found himself watching them more than he should have. The way they moved together, the way they kept close, like branches from the same root. It stirred something in him he couldn't name. Not desire, not yet, but recognition. These were people who had lost things too, maybe everything. You have names? He asked finally. The oldest met his gaze. Nayeli, she said, tapping her chest. Then she nodded toward the others. Ahyoka? Tiva. He repeated them under his breath, shaping each syllable carefully. Nayeli gave a faint nod, the first sign that she trusted him enough to speak again. They didn't ask his name. Maybe they already knew it didn't matter. When the meal was done, he opened the door to let in air. Sunlight spilled across the floor, catching in their hair like copper. For a heartbeat, the cabin looked alive, something he hadn't seen in years. Then he noticed the marks on their wrists, thin lines of old rope burns, half-healed. He turned away before they could see the anger in his face. You stay here, he said. Rest. I'll check the creek. Nayeli stood. You go alone? He nodded. She hesitated, then picked up his spare rifle and handed it to him. Bad men come. Her tone made it less a warning than a certainty. Elias accepted the rifle and left without a word. The path to the creek was quiet. He knelt at the water's edge, filled the canteen again, and studied the ground. Tracks 2 horses, days old, heading north. He followed them a short way, before stopping. He didn't want to know more. When he returned, the cabin was cleaner. Someone had swept the floor, stacked the wood by the stove, and folded the blankets. The smell of boiling herbs filled the air. Ahyoka was crushing something in a tin bowl, murmuring to herself. Tiva glanced up shyly, holding out a strip of cloth. For wound, she said. Elias took it, his throat tightening. He watched them for a long while. The rhythm of their movements, the whisper of their language, it all filled the room in a way he hadn't realized he'd missed. The cabin no longer echoed. That night, the wind howled across the ridge. Elias sat by the fire, polishing his rifle, eyes half closed. The women lay close to the hearth, wrapped in a single blanket. When Tiva began to shake in her sleep, Nayeli pulled her closer. Ahyoka's hand found Elias's canteen and placed it near her head like a talisman. Elias looked at it, the same canteen that had bound them all by a law he hadn't meant to follow. He didn't believe in tribal magic, but he couldn't deny what it had done. It had brought life into a house that had been empty for a decade. Outside, the moon hung low, pale as bone. Inside, the air was warm, thick with the sound of breathing. Elias leaned back, letting the chair creak beneath him. For the first time in years, he didn't feel haunted by ghosts. But as he closed his eyes, he heard something distant, a coyote's call broken by the echo of hoofbeats. He opened them again, heart tightening. The quiet wouldn't last. It never did. The morning wind carried dust instead of songbirds. Elias Crow stepped out of the cabin with his rifle slung over one shoulder, eyes scanning the ridge beyond the creek. The air was still, but the earth had changed. Even before he saw the prints, he could feel it. Something had crossed his land in the night. Down by the water's edge, 2 sets of hoof marks broke the crust of dry soil. The tracks were fresh, deep from riders who hadn't cared to hide their passing. He crouched, tracing the curve of one print with his finger. Iron shoes, heavy weight, riding west to east. Whoever they were, they'd ridden close enough to see the smoke from his chimney. He straightened, jaw tightening. The women were inside, unaware. For a second, he thought about lying, telling them nothing, pretending the world wasn't about to come knocking. But lies had a way of rotting faster than truth out here. When he stepped back into the cabin, the warmth of the fire hit him like another world. Ahyoka stirred a pot on the stove. Tiva was mending a sleeve with clumsy fingers, and Nayeli sat sharpening his old knife, the one with the bone handle. She looked up when he entered, eyes sharp. Men? She asked. Elias paused, then nodded once. Tracks. 2 horses. They rode near. A silence spread through the room. The crackle of wood was suddenly too loud. They find us, Nayeli said, not as fear, but as a fact. Maybe, Elias replied. Maybe not yet. He hung his coat on the peg, feeling the weight of her gaze. There was something in it, a question he couldn't answer. Would you fight for us? He didn't say yes, didn't need to. The rifle leaning against the wall spoke for him. He spent the next hour outside, tightening the shutters, checking the latch on the door, moving the saddle closer to the porch in case they had to ride. Each task was a memory of war measured, deliberate, meant to look calm even when the heart wasn't. When he came in again, Tiva was humming quietly, her voice thin but steady. The tune was strange, a kind of prayer that seemed older than the language he knew. Ahioka joined her, soft at first, then stronger. Nayeli didn't sing. She only watched him. Elias sat near the table, pouring himself a cup of black coffee gone cold. "You don't have to stay," he said suddenly. "If you go east, the hills'll hide you. I'll point the way." Nayeli set the knife down. "We stay," she said simply. "You gave." He shook his head, staring into the cup. "I gave water, not chains." She didn't argue. She just said, "Water makes a bond." The words hit him harder than he expected. They sounded like something his wife might have said in another life. By midday, a thin line of dust appeared on the far ridge. Elias saw it first, then cursed under his breath. 3 riders this time, moving slow, deliberate. Lawmen, by the glint of brass and the way one carried himself in the saddle. He called into the cabin, voice low but firm. Inside, quiet now. The women obeyed without question. He watched from the doorway, hand resting on the rifle stock as the riders closed the distance. When they stopped a few yards away, the one in front called out, "Crow, that your smoke we've been seeing?" Elias recognized the voice Deputy Farnham from Dry Creek. The man had a badge and the kind of smile that came easy when holding a gun. "Morning, Deputy," Elias said, calm but cold. "What brings you out this far?" "Looking for 3 runaways," Farnham replied. "Apache girls, belong to a man named Larrabee. Says they stole his horse and some goods." Elias's grip on the rifle tightened. "That right? And what's the law say about buying people now?" The second rider, a thin man with a scar on his cheek, spat in the dirt. "Law says stolen property gets returned." Elias met his eyes, voice flat. "No one's property under my roof." For a moment, no one moved. The wind shifted, pushing the smell of sage between them. Farnham's gaze slid toward the window where the curtain had fluttered. "You hiding someone in there, Crow?" Elias didn't blink. "You want to look inside my house? You'll need a warrant." "You got one?" Farnham hesitated, not eager to start trouble with a man known to shoot straight. The scarred rider sneered but held his tongue. "We'll be back," Farnham said finally. "Maybe with papers. Maybe with Larrabee himself." "You do that," Elias replied. They turned their horses, dust rising behind them. Elias watched until they disappeared over the ridge. Only when the sound of hooves faded did he lower the rifle. His hands trembled not from fear, but from something else. Inside, Nayeli stepped out from behind the curtain. "They come again?" Elias nodded. "They will." Ahioka looked at the rifle. "You fight?" He gave a tired half-smile. "If I have to." The cabin fell quiet again. But the silence wasn't the same as before. It wasn't the peace of safety, it was the breath before a storm. That night, when the fire burned low, Elias sat by the door, rifle across his knees. The women slept close to the stove, huddled beneath one blanket. The wind pushed dust through the cracks in the wall, whispering like ghosts. Elias looked at them, 3 lives tangled with his, and thought of the line he'd drawn that morning. There was no going back now. The desert would have its reckoning soon, and when it came, he would stand his ground. He closed his eyes, hearing the echo of Nayeli's voice in his head. Water makes a bond. Maybe it did? Maybe that was the only law that ever truly mattered. The next morning broke with a sky the color of ash. Elias Crow woke before the light, same as always, but this time the air felt heavier, thick with waiting. The fire had burned to a dull red heart. He fed it new wood and listened to the sound it made, the slow sigh of flame catching dry pine. The women were still asleep by the stove, their breathing even. Nayeli lay closest to the door, as if by instinct she meant to guard the others. Ahioka's arm draped loosely across Tiva's shoulder. The smallest one curled tight like she was still hiding from the Sunday. Elias stood a long moment, watching them in silence. He had lived through winters that had taken men apart piece by piece, through a war that had carved the soul out of him. But nothing had unsettled him like the sight of 3 strangers sleeping under his roof, as if they belonged there. He stepped outside, coffee pot in hand. The canyon was still, Only a ribbon of smoke rose from the chimney. Across the ridge, the dust from yesterday's riders had long settled. But his gut told him they weren't gone just circling. Wolves never left after the first sniff of blood. When he came back in, the smell of boiling herbs filled the room. Ahioka was already awake, stirring a tin pot on the stove. "Drink," she said, holding out a small cup. The scent was bitter, but he took it. It burned going down, sharp but not unpleasant. "Helps," she added, tapping her chest. "For fear." Elias gave a short laugh. "That so?" She nodded once. "Serious. We all drink." He didn't argue. Maybe they knew something he didn't. After breakfast, hardtack and rabbit stew left from the night before he sat by the table, cleaning his rifle. Nayeli watched him from across the room. "They come back," she said, voice certain. "I know. You run?" Elias shook his head slowly. "I don't run from what's mine." Her eyes held his for a long time, unreadable. Then she said softly, "We yours now. You give water." He looked up, met her gaze, and for a moment couldn't breathe. There was no teasing in her tone, no plea, just truth, the kind that asked nothing in return but changed everything once spoken. He stood, restless, moving to the window. "I gave you life. That's all." Behind him, she said something in Apache words, low and rhythmic, like a prayer. When he turned, she had lowered her head, hands clasped. Ahioka and Tiva had joined her, murmuring the same words. Elias didn't understand a single syllable, but somehow he knew what it meant. Gratitude, loyalty, bond. It should have comforted him. It didn't. It frightened him in a way he hadn't felt since the war because it meant he could lose again. By noon, the wind shifted. He felt it before he saw it, a restlessness in the horses, a stillness in the birds. Then dust rose on the horizon. 3 riders again. This time, they didn't stop at the ridge. They came straight down. Elias called out, voice calm but cutting. "Inside. Stay low." The women obeyed without sound. He stepped out to the porch, rifle at his side. Deputy Farnham led the pack, his badge catching the light. The thin man with the scar rode behind him, and a third, a heavier one with a gray beard, followed close. Farnham reined in, dust swirling around his boots. "Mornin', Crow," he said, too smooth. "We come polite this time. Got Larrabee's claim in writing." He held up a folded paper. Elias didn't look at it. "You tell Larrabee he can read that to the rocks if he wants. No one's property here." The scarred man spat. "You think she's your wife now? That how it works?" Elias's eyes hardened. "I don't answer to men who buy others." The bearded man snorted. "Apache law don't mean nothing here, Crow." "Then neither does yours," Elias said quietly. Farnham's smile faltered. "We can make this easy, Crow. Let 'em come out. Nobody gets hurt." "They're not going anywhere," Elias said. For a long second, no one moved. The sun hung low and hot, the kind that made tempers burn fast. Then the bearded man dismounted, one hand drifting toward his revolver. Elias didn't warn him. The shot cracked the silence wide open. Dust leapt from the man's hat brim as he stumbled back, cursing. The bullet hadn't killed him, just cut the air too close to his ear. "You take one more step," Elias said, voice low but steady, "and I don't miss." Farnham's horse reared. "Easy, Crow. No need for blood." "Then ride away," Elias said. "You're not welcome here again." The men hesitated, exchanging looks. Finally, Farnham spat in the dirt and turned his horse. "You made your choice," he said. "When the law comes next time, it won't be me." "Good," Elias replied. "Then maybe it'll be someone who knows what the word means." They rode off, hooves pounding the dry earth until the sound faded into the hills. Elias stood still for a long moment, the rifle heavy in his hands. When he finally went inside, the women were waiting near the door. Nayeli's face was unreadable, but Ahioka's eyes gleamed with something fierce, relief or pride, he couldn't tell. "You fight for us," Nayeli said quietly. Elias set the rifle down. "I fight for what's right." Tiva stepped forward, her voice small but sure. "We right now." The words caught him off guard. He looked at them, 3 women who'd had everything stripped from them, yet somehow still believed in belonging, and something broke open inside him. He sat heavily by the fire, rubbing a hand over his face. The air smelled of smoke and sweat and fear, but underneath it was something else. Something alive. Outside, the wind carried the last trace of hoofbeats away. Inside, Nayeli knelt beside him and poured water into his cup, the same canteen he'd once lifted to her lips. "Drink," she said. "For bond." Elias took it, drank deep, and this time didn't try to argue. The law of water, it seemed, had already written its name across his heart. Night fell fast that evening, the kind of darkness that swallowed the canyon whole. The fire inside the cabin burned low, a red pulse against the wood. Elias sat by the table, rifle across his knees, staring into the coals until shapes began to move in them, faces from his past, names he no longer spoke aloud. Outside, the wind dragged across the dirt like a whisper. The horses in the corral shifted uneasily. He could smell the storm coming, not rain but dust and danger, the kind that never passed quietly. Behind him, the women worked in silence. Nayeli was melting animal fat for candles, Ahioka grinding herbs, and Tiva patching torn fabric into what looked like small bags. He didn't ask what they were doing. He already knew, preparing for whatever would come next. "They'll be back," Elias said finally, voice rough from hours without use. Nayeli didn't look up. "Yes, you should go before they do." She tied the wick, trimmed it short. "And leave you to fight alone?" He sighed. "I've fought alone most my life." She met his gaze then, steady and unwavering. "Not now." Elias looked away. The conviction in her eyes unsettled him more than fear ever could. He wasn't used to being believed in. He wasn't sure he deserved it. He stood and checked the latch on the door, then walked outside to the porch. The moon hung behind a thin veil of clouds, turning everything silver gray. He could see the valley stretch below, still, waiting. For a long time, he just listened to the wind, to the breath of the land, to his own heartbeat. He had lived out here so long that silence had become a kind of companion. But tonight, it felt heavier, pressing against his chest. When he went back inside, the air smelled of smoke and sage. The three women had finished their work. Ahioka was wrapping the small bags with twine, gunpowder, and sand, he realized. Makeshift flash charges. Smart. Deadly enough to scare off riders, if used right. He nodded slightly. "You've done this before." Ahioka looked up. "Not first time we run." That stopped him. He'd known they were hunted, but not how long, or how often. He felt a pulse of anger not at them, but at the world that had made them run at all. Tiva approached him shyly, holding out a strip of red cloth. "For you," she said. "Apaches say red means fight with heart, not hate." Elias took it, fingers brushing hers. The cloth was soft, smelling faintly of smoke and sweat. "Thank you," he murmured. He tied it around his left wrist, feeling the gesture weigh more than words. The fire cracked sharply. He poured himself a cup of coffee gone cold and sat again. The light caught Nayeli's face. There was something fierce there, something he couldn't look at for too long without feeling exposed. "You believe in their law," he said quietly. "The law of water?" she asked. He nodded. "Yes," she said. "Water gives life. Life gives bond. No break." He took a long breath. "And what if I'm not a man worthy of it?" She smiled faintly. "Water not choose worthy. It choose thirsty." The words hit him like a spark. Elias didn't answer. He just stared at the flames, letting them burn away the question that had haunted him for years. Whether he still deserved to live. Later, after the women had lain down, he went outside again. The desert night stretched endless before him. Stars flickered above, cold and distant. He crouched near the fence line, checked the traps, and then dug shallow holes where he would place Ahioka's powder bags come morning. He moved methodically, like a man building both his defense and his grave. When he returned, Nayeli was awake, sitting by the door with his revolver in her lap. "You should sleep," he said. "So should you," she replied. He leaned his rifle against the wall and poured himself a half cup of whiskey from the bottle he kept hidden behind the stove. "You always watch?" "Always," she said simply. "When danger come, we light fire, not run." Her tone made him pause. He studied her the way the firelight traced her jaw, the steadiness in her eyes. There was no fear in her, only resolve. You remind me of someone, he said quietly. Your woman? He nodded once. She was brave too. Naili looked into the flames. Then she proud. You fight still. He didn't know what to say. Instead, he reached into his pocket and drew out a silver locket, worn and dull. Inside was a small portrait, the edges blurred by time. He hadn't opened it in years. Now, for the first time, he didn't feel the need to close it again. When he glanced up, Naeli's eyes were on the locket, then on him. She gone, she said softly, not asking. Yes, but you stay. He nodded. Maybe that's my punishment. Or your chance, she said. Elias looked away, throat tight. Outside, thunder rumbled far beyond the hills. The storm had finally come. He checked the rifle one last time, then sat beside the door. Nayeli moved to the other side, both of them facing the dark through the narrow cracks between the boards. The wind howled, slamming dust against the cabin walls. Elias could feel it, the change in the air, the promise of violence. He thought of the creek, of the moment the first drop of water had touched her lips. He hadn't known then that it was a vow. Now he did. The flames trembled, throwing their shadows long and trembling against the wood. Elias whispered to no one, maybe to the ghosts that still lingered in the corners of the room. If fire's coming, then let it come. This time, I won't run. And outside, the storm began to answer. Dawn came without color. The world was a sheet of pale dust, sky and earth the same shade of gray. Elias Crow was already awake, standing by the window with the rifle cradled in his arms. He hadn't slept, none of them had. The night had been a long stretch of silence, broken only by the wind and the creak of the boards beneath his boots. He saw them first, the glint of metal on the ridge, the slow crawl of riders through the morning haze. For this time, Farnham leading, with two deputies and a man Elias hadn't seen before. Broad-shouldered, red coat, the smug ease of someone who believed the world was his to buy. Larabe. Elias stepped out to the porch as the riders halted near the fence line. Dust rose behind their horses like smoke. Farnham's voice carried across the still air. Crow, told you we'd be back. This here's Mr. Larab. He's come to collect what's his. Elias's answer was quiet but sharp. Ain't a man on this earth owns another soul. Larabe swung down from his horse, boots sinking into the sand. I paid for them, girls. They're mine by contract. You're harboring stolen property. Elias's eyes narrowed. Then your contract's with hell itself. He felt movement behind him, Nayeli's hand on the doorframe. Ahyoka just inside, with Tiva clinging to her sleeve. He didn't turn. He didn't want them to see his face. Larabe took a step closer. You think your gun makes you the law? Elias raised the rifle. No, but it'll keep me alive long enough to outlast it. Farnham cursed under his breath. Don't be a fool, Crow. There's 4 of us. Elias didn't blink. And there's 4 graves on this ridge if you try. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The wind dropped, the world holding its breath. Then Larabe sneered, hand twitching toward his revolver. That's when Elias fired. The shot cracked the morning wide open. Larabe's hat flew off, the bullet tearing through the brim just above his head. Next one won't miss, Elias said. His voice was calm, deadly. Farnham's horse reared, panic flashing in its eyes. One of the deputies swore, pulling his mount back. He's bluffing. But they could see he wasn't. The man's stance, the stillness in him, it was the kind born from too many wars and too many burials. Larab spat, face pale. You'll pay for this, Crow. Already have, Elias replied. The men hesitated, then turned. Dust swallowed them again, their curses fading into the wind. Elias stood still until the last echo was gone. Then he lowered the rifle, hands trembling only after the danger had passed. Behind him, Nayeli stepped out. She said nothing, just reached up, brushed a smear of soot from his cheek, and whispered, You fight with heart. He looked at her, exhausted, hollow, and alive. Yeah, he said softly. Guess that's the only way left. And as the sun finally broke over the ridge, lighting the cabin's roof in gold, Elias realized he hadn't just defended them. He'd chosen them. By the time the sun climbed high over the ridge, the canyon had gone quiet again. No dust, no hoofbeats, only the wind whispering through the mesquite. Elias Crow leaned against the porch post, the rifle still in his hands, though there was no reason left to hold it. His shoulders ached. His mind was empty. The fight was over, at least for now. Behind him, the cabin door creaked open. Nayeli stepped out first, her dark hair unbound, eyes calm in a way that made him forget the storm that had passed. Ahioka followed, carrying a pot of water from the stove, and Tiva trailed close, clutching a bundle of herbs. They moved together, silent, as if afraid that speaking too loud might wake the ghosts still lingering in the dust. Elias set the rifle down and took the pot from Ahioka. The water shimmered in the morning light. He could see his reflection there, a man older than he remembered, rough and scarred, but no longer hollow. "You stay," Nayeli said quietly, studying him. He gave a short, dry laugh. "I don't reckon I've got anywhere else to go." She nodded, as if that was all the answer she needed. "Then this home." The words caught him off guard. Home. He hadn't used that word in years. The cabin had always been shelter, never belonging. But now, with the sound of women's footsteps inside, the smell of bread baking over the fire, and the faint laughter of Tiva as Ahioka scolded her for spilling flour, it almost felt true. Elias sat on the porch steps, watching them. The world looked different in the light, less like a graveyard, more like a beginning. The creek below glimmered again, the first sign of thaw after months of drought. He thought about that day, the canteen, the first drop of water touching their lips. It had seemed like nothing, a moment of mercy. But mercy, he realized now, had a way of changing everything it touched. When Nayeli came to sit beside him, she carried 2 tin cups. She poured water into his first, then hers. "Drink," she said. He took a sip. The taste was clean, cold, alive. "In our tongue," she murmured, "when you give water, you give word too. A promise." Elias looked at her, eyes soft. "What kind of promise?" She smiled faintly. "To not let the heart go dry again." He turned that over in his mind, feeling the weight of it. Then he nodded slowly. "I can keep that one." They sat there for a long while, the quiet stretching easy between them. The wind carried the scent of cedar and smoke. Somewhere in the distance, a raven called once and flew off toward the Sunday. Elias lifted his cup again, holding it high as if in a silent toast to the water, to the word, to the bond he hadn't meant to make but could no longer live without. For the first time in a decade, he smiled. And the desert, for a breath, felt alive again.